And joining us now in studio, Adam Gopnik, author of The Table Comes First, Family, France, and the Meaning of Food, and a staff writer at The New Yorker. Hello, pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure to be here, Piya.
Okay, when most people
back
think...
home, I should say.
Thank you, welcome back home, I should say. When we think of food, a lot of people think of France, and it's a good place to start because, as you write, that's where our sort of modern understanding and ideas really stem from. So I want to go back to where you start in your book, which is really 18th century Paris. Take me back there and to the origins of the word restaurant.
It begins truly around 1780. Now, people have been going out to eat for as long as there have been people. I have a sister who's an archaeologist who discovered the world's first takeout window in an archaeological site in Azerbaijan, a Sumerian takeout window where they would provision the army as the guys trudged by. They would hand them, grain and beer, and they would go on. So obviously there have been places to eat for as long as there have been human beings eating. But the idea of the restaurant as a distinct social institution, a place where you and I might sit across from a table like this one on a first date, maybe even, and where a lot of our social life would pass, courtship, proposals, marriage, business, where you would have a menu with specific choices on it, where the kitchen would be hidden from you, where above all you would have choice, where you'd be able to say, I'll take this. That's an institution that really only begins around 1780 in Paris. Restaurant, the word, is actually refers to kind of restorative. That's really what it means. It's a bouillon that was served, a kind of health food that was served by a guy named Chantoiseau for the first time.
Now, it's a thing, not a place.
It's a thing, not a place. Now, of course, every history with an origin story is actually a little messy because there's many other elements going in. But essentially, the restaurant was an invention in France around 1780. And as always happens in life, right, the way that we encourage sex is by talking about health. That's why they call them health clubs, right? That's where you go to meet people now in the state of undress. And so the restaurant was officially a place where you went to drink healthy stock and bouillon out of clean copper kettles. You went to feel better, but actually you went for the social life of it, to meet people from the opposite sex, to meet people of the same sex perhaps who you were engaged with politically. And there's a location. What's fascinating, too, is that the first generation of restaurants around 1780, before the French Revolution, were in the Palais Royal, which is still in existence today in Paris. And it was really the world's first mall. The first mall. It was owned by a guy, an aristocrat, who was called Philippe Egalité, a left-wing aristocrat, a quality fill. And he rented out the arcades below his palace, his royal palace, to milliners and modistes, and above all to cafes and restaurants. So people would come to the restaurant as part of a new kind of social life. And the crucial thing, I think, to think about here is that it was neither private in the sense that it wasn't a club, it wasn't a place where you had to have exclusivity to get in. You had the money in your pocket, you were allowed in. So it wasn't private in any sense, but it wasn't fully public either. It wasn't a place where you went and then were forced into companionship with whoever else happened to be in the room. Just as in the restaurant now, you sat down with the person you wanted to sit at, but from the corner of your eye, you saw everyone else who was part of the social world.
Okay, I want to unpack some things that you just said. And the first thing is, and I loved your book, but one thing that I found disappointing for me is I've dined out on a story for as long as I can remember about this idea that the restaurant was born during the French Revolution and all these, these nobility.
Cut off the heads of the aristocrats and the cooks had no one left to feed.
And everyone said, oh, that's an awesome story. Where'd you learn that? And I said, I think I read it in the New Yorker. So, I made this.
Right.
Now, you have told me I've been perpetuating a myth for years.
Well, like most myths, there's an element of truth in the myth, too. It's certainly true that the social revolution that went on in the French Revolution encouraged new styles of eating, new ways of living. So it's true that once the hold of the aristocrats over the totality of the good life was lessened, then new institutions, essentially kind of middle-class institutions, would grow up, popular institutions. So in that sense, it's true. It's not literally true that they cut off the aristocrat's head and the poor cook was saying, who do I feed now? And then went and opened a restaurant. That didn't happen.
Okay, well, your book gives me lots of conversation to talk about, so I'm okay with putting that one to rest. When I walked into a restaurant in the 1780s, I was allowed to go as a woman.
Even as an unaffiliated woman, that's right. Unmarried, you weren't a courtesan if you were eating in a restaurant necessarily, because as I said, you were there for your health. And it was a kind of new way of having unregulated social encounters that were still socially acceptable. A restaurant wasn't a bordello. It wasn't. Now, Balzac, the great French novelist, referred to the Palais Royal, where all of these new restaurants were, as the lewd hangar like an airplane hangar, the lewd hangar of Parisian life. So there was a lot of sex going on, but it wasn't, it was in the modern sense, right? Sex through courtship, through offering, rather than sex just simply through buying.
The other part of your book focuses not on going out for dinner, but for staying home and having dinner, and about the meals that we have at home and where they come from, the idea of a recipe. So I want to go back in the same way that we did to the origins of restaurant as a bouillon soup. When and where did people first start writing down instructions about how to prepare meals?
Well, professional recipe books, books that chefs prepared for other chefs, are very old. They go back into the 17th, even 16th century. But they tended to be sort of in code. You know, you took, and you can still find them like this, you know, you took, make 6 quarts of Bigard sauce, kill 6 ducks, you have duck goes with sauce Bigard. They were just sort of shorthand for cooks who already knew how to do it. The idea of the modern recipe book is really a 19th century invention, the book that you would give to a young woman who was starting, and was women, starting out in life, who needed to know how to make things. And of course, it also marks the moment when middle-class women particularly didn't always have cooks, or didn't even often have cooks, when women had to cook for their families. So we have Mrs. Beaton's and so on. So it's another moment. So it's a 19th century invention, essentially, and it's one that we have a complicated relationship to, I think. You know, I'm one of those people. I lie in bed every night looking at recipe books, because I love to cook. My wife is turning down the pages of fashion magazines, and I'm there. And the truth is, as anybody knows who reads recipe books, I make maybe one new dish every 6 months. I'm basically reading it for the pleasure of seeing disassembled something that I would dream of assembling. It's a kind of vicarious pleasure that we get from the recipe book, and that's one of the reasons they proliferate so much. And that was true even in the 19th century. And there's a wonderful figure who I try to revive in The Table Comes First, a woman named Elizabeth Pennell, who wrote the first sort of very sexy, libidinal narrative recipe book called The Diary of a Greedy Woman. She was sort of the Padma Lakshmi of the 1890s, and, or maybe more like the Nigella Lawson. And she saw that recipes weren't satisfying if they were just lists of ingredients. She wanted to tell a little narrative that would communicate the excitement and the sensual pleasure of new food. It was a very radical thing for her to do, to declare herself not a good housekeeper, but a greedy woman. Greedy and woman weren't 2 words that were supposed to be in too close orbit in the period. So that's one of my wonderful discoveries. I don't know, wonderful, but one of my favorite discoveries in the course of doing this book. And as you know, I organized the book around 8 emails I wrote to Elizabeth Pennell.
We're going to talk more about Elizabeth Pennell in a little bit, but I found it interesting, because you love recipe books, you love reading them personally, and you talk a lot about how their recipes are these strange documents. I think you use the word weird.
Yeah.
What makes them so weird?
Well, you know how it is. In most of the life of the appetites, you know, you begin with the object, the girl, the boy, the thing, and you end with the ache, the heartache. And with a recipe book, you begin with the ache, the desire, the need, and you end with the object. When I was a kid growing up in Montreal, and I would stay home from school sometimes, and I would look through my mother's recipe books, and like all adolescents, I was incredibly greedy, and you would read a recipe for like Rigo Janci slices, a great Hungarian delicacy, and you had to make it. And the thing you finally made was sort of disappointing compared to the intensity of the ache that you brought to it, but that's really how we use recipe books. They're sort of in reverse. We don't eat it and then analyze it. We see the analysis, and then our appetite rises and we want to eat it. And recipe books are, I think, in their nature, always bound to be disappointing. No matter how good the thing is we make from them, they're always this short of the thing we imagined when we started making it.
Right, it's never as good as you expected.
Never quite as good as you expected, never quite the same as you expected, but it doesn't end the cycle, it just drives us on to the next thing. Well, that's the thing,
is that not then the purpose? Just keep striving for a better recipe, right?
An endless recycling of appetite, disappointment, and new. Does this not sound like life? The recipe book is the book of life in every sense.
I have to say, when you're talking about the aches of following instructions in a recipe, I mean, it doesn't, in a lot of ways, sound a lot different than other instructional documents. If you think of building IKEA furniture, a recipe sounds pretty much like trying to follow instructions from IKEA.
This is true, and we could spread it out to instructional books of a less tepid kind too, couldn't we? Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I'm terrible. I can cook okay, but IKEA furniture defeats me. We're up till 4 in the morning when you have to make those things for the kids that you buy. We bought them an Igloo once, right? You had to make it Christmas Eve, 4:30 in the morning, and I was still going through the book trying to figure it out.
The thing about IKEA furniture is that when you're done, there is great pleasure. Recipes, sometimes, like you say, there's a little bit of disappointment at the end because you wanted it to look exactly as it did in the cookbook, but also taste it the way that your imaginary palate had imagined.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Well, think about it. The IKEA thing has a one-on-one relationship between the instructions and the object. They give you the bits and pieces, right? The cooking doesn't have quite as neat a one-on-one relation because you have to go out and do the marketing. And the difference between the thing that they're imagining and the thing that you make is always real. And it doesn't stop us from reading another recipe book. It doesn't stop us from buying another recipe book.
You read recipe books every night?
Well, every night probably. You know, writers round out the truth a little bit.
Sure.
I read them 4 nights out of 7,
right.
But in literature, that's every night.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, let's get back to Elizabeth Pinnell because she is a significant part of your book. You send her emails in the book. She doesn't write any back, of course, because she's long gone.
Long dead.
But what does your imaginary correspondence with her really reveal about the differences between 19th century and 21st century food culture?
Such a good question. And that's sort of what they're there to do. So I should have a good answer, shouldn't I? I think that, well, 2 things, importantly. One is that she's a woman, and a greedy woman, a sensual woman, and she's in the process of trying to emancipate women from the tyranny of domesticity. I'm a man, obviously, and a greedy man. And I'm one of a generation of men who are in the process of trying to emancipate men from fear of the kitchen. We have re-entered the kitchen. We want to be the cooks in the family. Men have always been professional cooks, but they've very rarely been domestic cooks, except in extremis. So I'm there in the kitchen cooking every night, and it's a way of trying to create a new kind of masculine role, I suppose, because it's, as I say, it's not just me, it's a whole generation of men who are doing it. And she's outside the kitchen in a way, trying to say, don't be interested in food if you're a woman just because you have to feed your family. Be interested because it's part of the orchestral effects of sensual pleasure that are available to you. So that's part of the back and forth that goes on. Another thing that goes on back and forth is that she assumes the primacy of French cooking. You know, we talked about the restaurant around 1780. One of the effects of the birth of restaurant culture in Paris is that France became the place where food happens. And really until our own time, until my own lifetime, right up through the 1960s and 1970s, when my own dear parents would still go to France when they could to eat at 2- or 3-star restaurants, France was the place where food happened. And she bears witness to that. So she simply takes it for granted that a lot of her writing is going to be about dreaming of the places you ate in Paris. And if you can imagine what places to eat in London were like in 1890, you can see why. That's changed a great deal. Now though I think we have an enormous affection for France and for French food, the truth is that sort of the lingua franca of cooking is likely to be Mediterranean, Asian, much more than it is French. It's funny, in her book, actually, at one point, she has a whole chapter introducing this very alien and exotic thing called spaghetti to her readers, and she explains how you prepare spaghetti, and it was a new thing. So what I cook every night, even though I'm a Francophile and love Paris, I cook with a big wok, or I cook Italian food and so on too. So in a funny way, France is now in a rearview mirror, receding behind us. I still love French food, I still love the traditions and complexities of French cooking, but they are no longer at the forefront of our nightly attention.
You know, you talk about you being in the kitchen and other guys, and I always find it surprising when I'm, out with a group of people, men and women, that it's nowadays, it's the guys that are sitting around talking about growing their own food, cooking their own food. They're the ones preparing it. How did we, I guess I'm asking you, how did we get here? I mean, what is it saying about our modern culture?
I will now reveal the guilty secret of men cooking. It's that you get enormous credit for it with minimal effort, right? So if you're the guy who's behind the range, everyone who comes to visit says, oh, wow, what a good husband, a good father. He's in there cooking every night. The truth is, of all the chores that have to be done in the household, cooking is the most enjoyable and the one that's the most ostentatious, right? Nobody can miss it, right? Whereas the range of things that women, like my wife, still are compelled to do. My wife keeps a formula in her head at every moment, a recipe of what's happening with the children. She knows the pressure of every toe on every sock, and when it's about to break through before the hole actually appears. By comparison, I just am in there saying, who wants tuna au poivre for dinner tonight? And so you get credit for it. So it's a cheap way of winning big points as a domestic husband. I think that's part of it. At another level too, one of the things that's absent in our lives very much, actually I'm thinking of writing my next book about this, is a sense of accomplishment, of mastery, of craft, of the artisanal. And cooking is a sort of shortcut to mastery. It's an accomplishment that anyone can have, and you can have it every night. It's artisanal, it's handmade, it still is. And in a world where so much of our lives have been made abstract, I spend basically what I spend my day doing is manipulating little pixels on a screen. Then the pixels come bouncing back to me, and then more pixels will come bouncing back to me in the form of good reviews, bad reviews, and numbers on a bank account. That's my life. It's simply pixels interrupted by caffeine. That's how I spend my day. And then at 6 o'clock, I go in and I am in touch with the tangible. I'm in touch with the material. And I think that appeal, the appeal of the real, is still part, a bad little Muhammad Ali style rhyme, the appeal of the real. I think that's a big part of cooking.
But it's interesting because that appeal is really, nowadays, that men find that appealing, whereas women are like, not as much into cooking as men are.
Obviously, with 1,000 exceptions,
yeah.
I think that's true. It's, as I say, because I suspect it's also because we feel that there's an element of mastery involved. I think women still often love to cook, but women don't need to demonstrate that they're good at it in quite the same way. We had a dear old friend of an other generation, and he was simply convinced that my wife, because she was a wonderful woman, was a wonderful cook. In fact, she can make nothing except salad dressing. But it was sort of in his, he's gone now, alas, but it was sort of in his mind, born in the 1920s. If you're a great woman, you can do any job and be a lawyer or a doctor, and you're a great cook. So it's sort of on the roster of expected women's accomplishments. And as a consequence, it's less of an accomplishment for a woman than it is for a man.
So there's different rewards.
Yeah, exactly. Just in the same way, I haven't thought this through before, but in the same way perhaps that, so many women I know have exceptional athletic accomplishments now. They become the triathletes, they become the marathoners, because it's not on the expected roster of feminine accomplishments maybe, and therefore it is a true accomplishment. It demonstrates mastery in a more visible or even ostentatious way.
Well, perhaps like your wife, I'm glad that men have entered the kitchen because I too am not a great cook. I want to come full circle to the beginning of your book. It starts with a letter by Jacques Decarro, and I'm going to read a little bit about what he says, but tell me who he was first.
Jacques Decarro's real name was Daniel de Courdemanche, and he was a French resistor, highly educated man who taught, ironically of all things, German at a lycée in Paris. Joined the resistance, was a communist, an intellectual communist of a kind, and was arrested by the Germans, the Nazis, and sentenced to death. And on the last morning of his life, he decided to write a letter to his parents, of course. And in this letter to his parents, he talks not about the glory of France, not about the solidarity of the working class, nor about the meaning of life. He talks about food. He talks about the great meals that they had shared together, and he asks his parents to send the menu of an auberge in the country to his girlfriend.
So let me read just a little
bit.
bit. He says, "All these last days I've thought a lot about the good meals that we should have together when I was free. You will eat them without me, all the family together. But not sadly, please. I don't want your thoughts to dwell on the good times that we might have had, but on those that we really have shared. During these 2 months of solitude, without even anything to read, I've run over in my mind all my travels, all my experiences, all the meals that I have eaten. I even composed the outline of the novel. I had an excellent meal with Sylvienne on the 17th. I've often thought of it with pleasure, as well as of the New Year's supper with Pierre and Renee. Questions of food, you see, have taken on great importance." Here's a man, Adam, that's about to be executed, and yet the questions of food are sort of his final thoughts, and they're of such great importance.
It's one of the most beautiful letters I know. When I came upon that letter, I knew that was the theme of my book. What does he mean by questions of food? What's its import? And I think and sort of the whole book is a, I hate the word quest, but it's a search to find out what he meant. But I think we know in some deep intuitive sense what he meant. He meant that questions of food are questions of family, questions of food are questions of communality. They're questions of people gathered around. For a man who had rejected conventional faith, what could be a more powerful symbol of what had made his life worth living, of what he believed in, than the meals he had shared with other people? They were the thing that came first into his mind at the last moment of his life. as a symbol of what he valued in life. Now, one way we say, boy, he was a French guy, right? He's thinking about good meals in the face of the firing squad. But I find it an incredibly moving and universal moment, because what he's saying to us is, don't think about the afterlife. Think about the best of this life. And he's saying to his parents, remember the pleasures that we shared, often around a table, and you will understand what I believe in.
And for Jacques Decarro, like most of us, you know, his taste is really shaped by the context of his experience and the expectations of how things will taste. And then, I mean, doesn't it in that way, I'm trying to extrapolate a bit here, but doesn't it then make it a bit difficult for a chef to adjudicate taste, or you as a writer to write about taste?
Taste is one of the most complicated and compound and difficult and torturously painful concepts to analyze, because we know two things about it. One is that we know that everybody has it, everybody governs their life by it. We all talk about it all the time. It's not mysterious in that way. And at the same time, we also know that it changes all the time. We know that the tastes of this generation are not the tastes of a previous generation, and we sort of have to know that the tastes of ours are not going to be the tastes of our children or our grandchildren. So we accept simultaneously that it's something we feel passionately about. It's not something we shrug our shoulders about. We get angry about it. Who do you like better, Joni Mitchell or Bob Dylan? What do you think is better, Japanese or Chinese food? These are deep questions. But at the same time, we accept that they change all the time. We accept that taste simultaneously reflects our deepest values, as with Jacques Decarro, the things we believe in, and it reflects our superficial pleasures, the fashions that we go through. And trying to sort of parse the play between value and fashion in this question of taste is extremely complicated.
What's the great lesson from 19th century food that we should emulate today?
I think there's one lesson that runs through the whole history of food, from that Sumerian takeout window right through Jacques Decarro and Elizabeth Pennell to our own time. That is simply that what goes on around the table or around the takeout window, even around the prison cell, matters as much as what's on the table. That finally we can never separate our social lives from our lives as eaters. And the more we try to do that, the more we betray the reason that we come to the table in the first place.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left. You're a chef or an amateur chef? A cook?
A cook.
Okay, cook. And you read recipes almost every night, 4 nights a week.
The other nights I'm reading hockey almanacs. But,
good. You're a true Canadian.
I am that.
Tell me your favorite recipe books.
Oh, wow, good question. My favorite recipe books, quickly off the top of my head, I like Patricia Wells' French Bistro Cooking, Parisian Bistro Cooking, I think it's called. Terrific, simple, good things. The River Cafe cookbooks from London by Ruth Rogers and Rose Gray are equally good, elemental, and profound in a way about Italian food. And I love, at a kind of more complex, high level, I love the cookbooks of Robert Courtine, who was a French writer, really wrote about food, did food books. But he has a wonderful book called The 100 Glories of French Cooking, which is incredibly sort of snooty, super looking down, supercilious writing about the greatness of French food, but they're so rich in lore and sensuality and history that they're irresistible.
Okay, when I now get invited to your home in New York for dinner, are you going to cook me something out of those books?
Absolutely. I probably would do you a roast chicken out of Patricia Wells, covered with its breast covered with duck fat. We don't tell the kids that's what it is. Or I would do you something simple and delicious like a penne amatriciana from the River Cafe cookbook. Or if I had a little more time, if it was a weekend, I might do you something like, what might I do? I might do like a buffalo mode, great braised beef surrounded with vegetables and the sauce thickened with a calf's foot, which you can find celebrated in Robert Courtine.
Okay, I accept the invitation. That is
You're
yet
welcome.
to come my way. We're going to talk about why we're not going to tell the kids about the duck fat tomorrow. We'll see then.
Terrific.
Okay?
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.